I'm overwhelmed, and you're probably overwhelmed too, because the amount of news coming out of Israel this week has been insane. But have no fear, here on the Meira K Show, we are going to organize it all and hopefully make it simple and easy to understand. This war, we are focusing in on what is going on in Gaza with all the aid, what happened with Yaron at the embassy, total madness and insanity, our new head of the Shin Bet and obviously Supreme Court drama, and everything that he said about the war before it actually happened. And of course, Yair Golan and this new thing that we are seeing of ex-IDF heads coming out against Israel. In addition, obviously we'll be reviewing a book and a new segment, news that you'll only hear about over here because it's just not part of the mainstream media. Hi, and welcome back to another episode of the Meira K Show, where we'll be discussing everything happening here in Israel. We've got a packed episode as always, so let's dive right in. Okay, you're probably wondering about the aid, what's going on, why has it restarted, and you know my personal opinions. But I don't want to talk about what I think so much today. I actually want to share both sides of the arguments and let you come and draw your own conclusions. So, the war in Gaza intensified already last week, but as of the last 24 hours, it has really intensified. And by that, I mean they have sent basically every important IDF brigade into Gaza. And Gaza is divided at the moment into three different sections. You've got the north, you've got the south, and you've got the center. The center, interestingly enough, we have hardly touched, and that's where we assume that all the hostages are. We've got the south and we've got the north, and Rafah, as you know, has basically been decimated, and we're moving forward in Khan Yunis, but there's a new strategy going on. And this strategy is a little bit slower than previous, but much better. And why do I say that? Well, the strategy now is us slowly destroying everything in our wake. Whilst in the previous military operations, what we've done is kind of go in, come out, touch upon buildings on the top, maybe try to go into some tunnels. Now we are slowly decimating, inch by inch, everything on top of Gaza and everything under Gaza. And this is obviously a really intense military operation. Now, the idea behind this is that we are going to try and create some sort of buffer zone, some sort of area which is completely Hamas free. And then, if this pilot works, the idea is to bring in about 120,000 Gazans, all who have gone through security screenings and a complete removal of any sort of military arms. They will move into these buffer zones, and then American private companies will distribute aid. So we will be incentivizing Gazans who are not currently leaving Gaza to move into this new location where they can receive a huge amount of aid. It will be distributed and there'll be no Hamas control in these areas. It sounds like a good idea, except for the fact that up until this point, we have been sending more aid, and that started last week, but it hasn't been distributed by these US American private companies, which means, unfortunately, it is going right back into the hands of Hamas. So let's pause for a second and pull back. Up until a few weeks ago, it was clear that with this new ending of the ceasefire and the new military operations, everybody was saying outright, we are not allowing any aid to go into Gaza under any circumstances. But in the last week, suddenly Netanyahu announces that aid will be going in, but we're going to ensure it doesn't reach the hands of Hamas. Alas, within a few days, it is announced that at least 10% of this aid has reached the hands of Hamas because, obviously, you see, you can't expect to do something the same way and to receive different results. If there was a clear way for us to bring aid into Gaza without Hamas stealing it, then that's what we would have done from the beginning. But there was kind of this very coy and unclear strategy being announced that we're going to bring in private distributors, etc., and that will change the way that Hamas is able to access the aid. And so people kind of assumed here in Israel that that's already started. And then last night it's announced that it hasn't, and the aid has basically been going in the same way that it has up until this point. So why should the aid go in and why should the aid not go in? Okay? Number one, international condemnation. Now, you know how I feel about this. I think that Israel should not pay any attention to what international parties think about us because no matter what we do, they will hate us. However, there are real life ramifications and sanctions that could happen if Israel is seen as committing war crimes, so to speak. So Netanyahu makes this announcement, and within a day, it's announced to the public that the EU is considering sanctioning Israel, etc., because of our lack of aid. And there's a blood libel that is being spread all over the world at the moment. 14,000 babies potentially could die. as if that's really the case. In fact, surprise, surprise, 50,000 babies have been born since the beginning of the war in Gaza, which is pretty impressive for a war zone, if you ask me. But again, this is not about me. We are the most humanitarian country in the world, and I believe that 100%, right? So we take it upon ourselves, even though it is not our responsibility, to make sure that the Gazans are not starving. Now, up until this point, the fact that we have been giving aid to the Gazans has basically meant that Hamas steal that aid and then they control all the Palestinians and make them do what Hamas want them to do. So we've said enough is enough. But now, because the situation has gotten so dire and because Israel's military pressure has increased and because of the intensified pressure externally, Israel is making a diplomatic move basically to kind of get the pressure off their back and say, no, we are giving aid. And what kind of aid are we giving? Only food, okay, and water, like very, very simple aid. Again, I'll remind you, it is not Israel's responsibility to do this, but so that when the EU comes for us and when other countries decide to come after Israel, because they always do, Israel can turn around and say, no, actually, we are doing the humanitarian thing. We aren't breaking any sort of international law. And that's actually the argument for us sending aid into Gaza. There's going to be a diplomatic backlash on us if we don't, which could lead to sanctions and lack of trade and economic issues with the country. And so to avoid that, we're allowing a minimal amount of aid. Okay, I can understand that. The arguments against aid are as such. Number one, not our obligation. Why should we be doing it? Number two, how can we know for a fact that it's not going to enter the hands of Hamas? And this is where kind of this U.S. private organization that's going to come in and distribute it in a different way begins. But at the moment, we've already seen Netanyahu admit to the fact that 10% of the aid has reached the hands of Hamas. So I'm not sure that there's actually a strategy in which Hamas can't steal the aid. Number three, and this is probably the most important one of all of the arguments, is that we all want the hostages to come home, and we understand that Hamas are not interested in giving us back the hostages because it is their final card. However, this intense military operation that we have started, in the addition of us removing and taking out so many of their leadership. Do you know that there was like this image? I'm going to show it to you guys in a second. But there were so many Hamas leaders. We have taken out basically every single important one except for two. Okay, there are only two important leaders left, and that includes the Sinwar brothers. I don't know if you guys heard about it, but this week, both Mohammed Sinwar and Zakaria Sinwar were eliminated probably. It takes some time to confirm because obviously we don't have access to their bodies, but based on the way that they communicate and based on the information that we find out from Hamas, we can figure out after a few days or a few weeks if they've been eliminated, and it looks like they've been eliminated. And so they're the ones actually who have been holding back the hostage deal. But coming back to the reasons why aid is dangerous for this war, well, if we continue with this military operations to take out the leadership and we strangle Hamas, so to speak, financially by not allowing them to have any aid, and we increase the pressure on the Palestinians who are fighting back against Hamas. We're seeing more and more protests internally against Hamas because there is no food. And in addition, we have these military operations in which we've announced that we are not giving back any of the land. This is kind of the full-pronged trifecta that works to get Hamas to say, okay, we will give back the hostages. And we saw that there was a movement forward with the negotiations happening in Qatar. Alas, within 24 hours of us announcing that the aid is coming back, we are restarting it, Hamas pull out of the hostage negotiations. Now, as you all know, again, I am not for us giving or even negotiating any sort of anything to do with the hostages, but I do believe that the hostages really need to come home, and so there needs to be some sort of back and forth and at least this intensified pressure to get them to come back. Hamas were almost there. They were publicly saying that, yes, we want to be in discussions, and literally the second we announced that the aid is going back, they pull out of the conversations. And yep, Netanyahu has brought back the entire delegation because it's kind of reached a dead end. This is what's so frustrating about the aid. There are arguments for us sending aid in. There are arguments against us sending aid in. But to me, the idea that we are putting our soldiers in danger every single day, and it's not clear to me the argument whose lives are more important, IDF soldiers or hostages in captivity. It's not a clear argument for and against each one. We're sending them in and at the same time allowing for Hamas to gain control again and to breathing life back into them by sending aid is very, 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 very frustrating. And so that's the debates. It's between us being perceived as a humanitarian country, doing what we're supposed to do, and really trying out this new system in which we create these buffer zones where Gazans can go into, and we'll rebuild and try out this world in Gaza in which the Palestinians are not controlled by Hamas, or intensifying the military pressure and getting the hostages home. And that's kind of the debate right now happening in Israel. And it is not an easy or simple debate, but I can say that many, many, many people are very, very frustrated with the aid going in, me included. And there have been protests to try and stop the trucks going in, like people literally standing. They're part of a group called Savteisha. They stand in front of the trucks and block them. And I think this is part of Netanyahu's attempt to keep the diplomatic scene happy. And I'm talking about Trump as well in this, right? Trump doesn't want us to be perceived as losers. And Trump really, at the end of the day, wants this whole conflict to end. And he doesn't want us to be seen and perceived as killing Gazan babies, okay? He doesn't want us to be seen that way. And so there is a bit of a pressure from the US, but more it's coming from the EU to start this aid. And I believe that's why Netanyahu started it, although it's unbelievably frustrating. Which brings us on to the next subject, which is the new head of the Shin Bet, or the new person that Netanyahu wants to bring in, a guy by the name of David Zini. Now, this is interesting because we've discussed in past episodes kind of the conflict between the IDF and the government, and this kind of escalated into a head. Obviously, the Supreme Court and the Attorney General are involved in all this, so let's try and clarify it quickly without too many details, but hopefully it'll be easy to understand by the end of it. So, Ronen Bar, as we all know, the person, in my opinion, responsible for October 7th, was removed from the head of the Shin Bet by Netanyahu, and then the Supreme Court came in and said, that is unlawful, you can't do it, even though the law is really 100% in Netanyahu's favor. Now, we know that the Supreme Court has a tendency to kind of overreach its boundaries and try and make rulings that they really shouldn't. So once Netanyahu announced this, there was a whole hullabaloo within the Supreme Court, and then Ronen Bar, after so much media complications and drama, decides to step down. Once Ronen Bar decided to step down, the government pulled out their appeal to have him fired, so to speak, because he's now stepped down, in hopes that the Supreme Court would then say, okay, since this is no longer an issue, we are not going to make a ruling on it. But obviously the Supreme Court just couldn't help themselves, and although they were given a lifeline to back out of their overstepping, they decided to continue to overstep, and they do, of course, coming out with a new law yesterday, which we're just not going to touch upon because it's not relevant to our story right now. But yesterday, despite all of this drama with Ronen Bar and the head of the Supreme Court, Netanyahu decides to appoint this new guy, David Zini. Now, why do we love this guy? And why has Netanyahu appointed him? Well, he came out, okay, with an inquiry a few months before October 7th, in which he basically said what we now know to be true, that there is danger on almost every single one of our borders with Gaza, and an infiltration could really happen very, very soon. He's also much more right-leaning. He is anti a hostage deal, does not believe that we should release terrorists in exchange for hostages, and really, really stands behind increased military pressure. He was also there on October 7th. And if you read this part of what David Zini said before, it is utterly astounding. He called out what was going to happen on October 7th. And this is the reason Netanyahu has chosen him, because despite all the public pressure and despite the fact that so many people disagreed with him, he was able to see through all the lies, to see through kind of this idea that we are safe and they're deterred, and to actually see what was happening on the ground. And so he makes a great head of the Shin Bet. He makes a great head of the internal intelligence. Obviously, a lot of people don't like him because he is more right-leaning, right? He wears a kippah, he has 11 children, which is nuts, but he has a very, very high level of IDF experience, a huge amount of IDF experience, and I think he's going to be a great person for this. Now, where did more drama happen? Well, there was an announcement made by the head of the IDF. We've previously discussed that the head of the IDF and the government have kind of clashed a little bit, with the IDF wanting to take liberties in a certain way and calling out the government and not exactly doing what the government says. But still, the main enemy here in this country, as I believe, is the media, and the media is the one who kind of threw this thing out of control. Because David Zini, who has got a position in the IDF, now has to be removed from his position to some degree so that he can move over to the Shin Bet. And a statement was made by the head of the IDF saying he has had a conversation with Zini, so it's Zamir and Zini, confusing, two names that sound very similar. They've had a conversation, and now he is stepping down so that he can go into this new position. But he added this kind of vague statement at the end, saying something along the lines of, if you're an IDF person in conversation with the government, it has to go through the head of the IDF. Why did he say that? Well, because it was rumored that maybe Zini kind of did this behind Zamir's back, had a conversation with Netanyahu, never discussed it with Zamir, and then left his position. But that's not actually what happened. The Israeli media turned it into a whole hullabaloo, saying Zini has been removed from his position in the IDF. Hudach. He has been relegated, okay? And that is not actually what happened. What happened is what needs to happen. If you're in a position in the IDF, you can't serve as the head of the Shin Bet. They met. Netanyahu had this kind of quick conversation with him. They decided that Zini needs to come in. Zini immediately reported this to Zamir, and Zamir said, okay, with all due respect, you can now leave and go to your new position. That's what happened. The media in Israel obviously made it out to seem like there's a whole conflict. There isn't a conflict, which is good news because there is always a conflict. And talking about conflicts, listen to this. The Attorney General lied, okay? She lied, like you can't believe. She released a statement saying that she had no relationship whatsoever to Ronen Bar, right? And to one of the lead persecutors on the trial against Netanyahu, which is obviously still going on, which is totally mad. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because again, I think that the whole way that the media and the Supreme Court and the Shin Bet have been running has been really confusing. The Attorney General's husband has been very, very ill for many, many years, and he used to be in the Shin Bet, okay? And he had close relationships with Ronen Bar and with this guy who's persecuting Netanyahu. The Attorney General released a statement the other night saying this isn't true and it didn't happen and they never had a relationship, except for the fact that her brother, okay, has repeatedly posted on Facebook over the years, thanks to these people, literal thanks to them, saying thank you so much for visiting and being in touch and staying such good friends and helping us. So the Attorney General has come out with these statements and there are online receipts negating them and saying that they did have a relationship. So we're going to see how this moves forward because at the same time that everything that's been going on, the Supreme Court still keeps on coming out with these rulings. And Israeli Supreme Court has this tendency to overstep its boundaries, which we've spoken about a lot, but also to do something really sneaky. In the time that there's a lot of media hullabaloo, for example, Idan Alexander is being released, they will release a statement which is really, really controversial, but hope that it kind of disappears into the media. I do want to note that while Zini has been appointed, so to speak, by Netanyahu, there is still a process that he has to go through with the Supreme Court and with the Attorney General. And the reason I brought all of this up is because it's not so clear that it's going to be smooth sailing up until this point. The Attorney General has come in with a statement saying that there's no real need for us to rush into bringing in a new head of the Shin Bet, and that's untrue. Israel's security really, really depends on having an internal intelligence leader who knows what he's doing. So we're going to see more and more of this kind of controversy and drama pop up, personal attacks and statements being made, and we're going to have to see how Netanyahu plays this. Will Zini be positioned into his position despite all of this balagan, or will it be pulled back from and take some time for him to get the appointment? Let's hope that he is allowed to become the head of the Shin Bet. Obviously, they're bringing up Qatargate as one of the reasons that he can't come in because, as we've discussed, Qatargate is potentially, something that maybe Zini shouldn't be involved in or Netanyahu shouldn't be involved in. But Netanyahu has made it clear. Zini can come into this position and he won't touch Qatargate, okay, to remove all of those discussions. And again, it's all very, very complicated. Internal politics, lots of drama that's really unnecessary, but we will see how it unfolds. Let's hope for Zini being appointed, for the Qatargate story to kind of end soon, and for things to go back to normal, the Attorney General to be removed, the Supreme Court to be put in its position, to stop doing these crazy petitions which aren't in their place, and some quiet. Which brings me to segment 3, because we have not had a lot of quiet because of Yair Golan. Okay, you may have never heard of Yair Golan, but he used to be one of the heads of the IDF. He was a politician and still is a politician. He runs a party called the Democrats. Why do I say the Democrats? Because it's actually an extreme left party here in Israel that have been labeled that because they're good at branding. In the same way that the Palestinians believe that it's resistance, they call themselves the Democrats, while actually they are not a very democratic party. And this guy came out at the beginning of the week saying something along the lines of, the IDF likes to kill babies as a hobby. Infuriating. And I was not the only one who was infuriated. People across the political spectrum lost their minds at the statement, called for him to revoke it. In the past, he's called the IDF the Nazis, which is just madness because he used to run the IDF. Now, we've also got at the same time this guy, Ehud Olmert, who used to be our prime minister, coming out and saying things that like, Israel is near to committing war crimes, etc. And these people are part of this new phenomena. I do want to add that Yair Golan last night kind of apologized and said, no, I meant the government. No, I didn't really mean that. Of course, I didn't mean that. He's trying to backtrack because the fallout from this has been insane. I mean, even Herzog, the president of Israel, who doesn't really tend to get involved in politics, has called this statement out. And Yair Golan's now being revoked almost from the army. Okay, the head of the defense has said that he can't come and he can't serve in Miluim, in the reserves, because it's actually nuts to be calling the IDF out for such things, which are so not true. You do know who likes to kill babies for hobbies, right? Like, It's not the IDF. So Yair Golan is in a lot of trouble, but I want to talk about the phenomena of people who used to serve in the IDF, people who used to serve this country coming out against our own people and calling us what our enemies call us. Obviously, the dangers of this are enormous, and I think that's pretty self-explanatory. It gives so much ammunition, and it didn't take a long time for our enemies to ride on this, right? To take these quotes, to go as far as they could with us, even saying ludicrous things like, oh, Israel might kill 14,000 babies in the next 24 hours or whatever, just ludicrous blood libels. And now we've got Paris and Canada and London and whatever coming out saying that they might recognize a Palestinian state. The fallback from this has been enormous. But the phenomena comes for two reasons. Number one, the anti-Netanyahu derangement syndrome in this country is not to be underestimated. Okay? I think it's similar to what happens with Trump in America, but here people will literally do anything and say anything to bring Netanyahu down. He is so unbelievably hated by so many people, and don't underestimate how people are willing to bring him down. They're willing to burn down the whole country. I don't think they have any sort of understanding of what dirty laundry being aired does to us internationally. I think people are so focused on nuanced topics here in Israel. And this is actually something that I spoke about, not just in Israel, but as a Jewish platform as a whole. This week, I got a lot of hate for something that I said, which was such a niche point on my social media. And I posted about it saying that, guys, we can't be fighting over really niche points when we have massive enemies on the outside. And this is something that the Palestinians understand really well. They do not air dirty laundry. They do not fight about internal problems publicly. They have a very clear stance of what goes out. But here in Israel, there's a tendency to make catfights something that the whole world should see. And so they are willing to do anything for a niche point of bringing Netanyahu down from the government. They're willing to burn the whole country down with them. Okay, that's point number one. Number two, relevance. Okay, these people have gone from being really high-end leaders of the IDF, leaders of the country, to being irrelevant. Okay, and they know that, and they don't like that because most people who are in power don't like not having power anymore. So they come up with insane things to make them relevant and to put them in the media spotlight. Yeah, pure ego. And again, they don't care if it brings the house down. They are willing to do it for their own personal gain. And this is something that I think there needs to be legislation against. If you are somebody who previously was involved in the IDF and you come out saying these kind of statements, then you need to be punished for that. You do, because you are actually endangering our soldiers. You are actually allowing for them to be sanctioned internationally, for them to really, you're setting them back with their military operations, right? You don't know the fallback of what can happen when you make a negative statement about our IDF. And these are soldiers who are sacrificing their life. And on that point, I just want to say, we are probably going to be hearing about more injured and more, unfortunately, casualties as the IDF military operations intensify. And so we need to pray and we need to think about them. But they need to be the country's priority. And people making statements that endanger them need to be persecuted for this, non-negotiably. Which brings us to segment 4. The atrocious and heartbreaking murder of Yaron and Sarah outside of the embassy in United States, Washington, a few days ago. This shocked us, and it shocked me personally because I actually knew him. I didn't know him well, but I'd met him at a few different conferences, and to see his face in the morning on the news was very disheartening. Now, what was interesting about Yaron is that he's actually not even a Jew. He's a Christian, a devout Christian, and he was a proud Israeli. He came from Germany in 2016. He served in the IDF, and he was a diplomat for Israel, and so was his soon-to-be fiancée, because it's now public knowledge that he was about to propose in Jerusalem to Sarah Milgram, a beautiful diplomat known by so many people that I know and love and cherish. And honestly, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking for a few reasons. Number one, the story of how they were eliminated is a little bit nuts, right? This guy comes and shoots at them, and then actually leaves his gun outside and runs into this event. And people were trying to help him and take care of him. And then they discover, when the police come in, that he was actually the shooter. He was very overwhelmed. And then obviously he screams pro-Palestine. And this is frightening. It's frightening for Jews everywhere that we've shifted a little bit from online inflammatory statements to actual murders. Just plain pure murders in the name of these ideologies. And next week, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. Okay, that's what our deep dive is going to be focused on. What is going on with all of this incitement and hatred? How did the Palestinians convince the West to hate the Jews so much? What is this revolution almost that gets people to come and murder other people based on a cause that honestly they don't even have so much to do? I think this is such an important thing for us to unpack, and we will be discussing it next week. But people everywhere are very scared, and security has been upped across all embassies of Israelis. And I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the fear of anti-Semitism becoming something real. It's scary, and I want to validate that for you. If you're somebody outside of Israel who is feeling the fear, that is legitimate, because this is a step up in many ways. But it is also a step up for us. It is also an important thing for us to realize that we cannot back down in the fight against anti-Semitism. We cannot back down on legislation and figuring out how to make this whole thing end to some degree. And I think a big part of that is us figuring out what our responsibility is. Why has anti-Semitism come to us? What does this look like, and how can we fight back? I believe that Jewish children should be learning to stand up for themselves and to go into defense classes, but also in general, I feel very, very strongly that what we have done up until this point to fight anti-Semitism, the legacy organizations who are apparently fighting this are not doing enough. They're not doing enough, and there needs to be a shift. There needs to be a shift from the Israeli government. There needs to be a shift from us as individuals fighting back, figuring out what that looks like, what that means, and taking it very, very seriously, because this cannot become a norm. Our thoughts are with the family of Yaron and Sarah and all the people who know them, and we are praying for security everywhere. May we hear good news soon. Absolutely heartbreaking. And on that tragic and horrible piece of news, it brings me to Meira Brings a Book, one of my favorite segments. And this week, actually, I have an interesting book. It's a little bit of a different choice because there have been many books written at this point about October 7th, but most of them are in Hebrew, which I think is really unfortunate. And we need to get a lot of them translated because October 7th has become kind of like a vague statement. October 7th, lots of people killed, lots of people kidnapped, but there were so many stories. Okay, if you think about 1,200 people killed, if you think about 250 people kidnapped, if you think about 6,000 terrorists coming in and infiltrating, there are so many stories. And most of these stories have just kind of disappeared. And it is my belief that we have to do our very, very best to remember as many of these stories as possible. As many of these stories as possible. And so the more documentation we can do, the more remembering of what October 7th actually was, instead of us just creating this vague statement of October 7th, that is really important. But there's also a very interesting side to October 7th, and this is the book that we're going to review today. The October 7th War, the military side of it. And I find this fascinating as somebody who focuses on the Middle East and geopolitics and everything that's going on. This book was really, really interesting. Written by Seth Frantzman, the October 7th War discusses what happened before October 7th? What was going on in Gaza? How did it begin? How did the Hamas come to be? What were the mistakes made? It discusses what happened on October 7th. And if you're interested in actually the military operations and how they worked, this is fascinating. And then part 3 of the book discusses the aftermath. The first 5 months, it doesn't go into 600 days, which we are reaching this week, which is absolutely petrifying. But it kind of reviews the military side, and I highly recommend it if that's of interest to you, if that's how you connect. You see, every person needs to connect to this war in a different way. For me, connecting to the individual stories breaks my heart. It is something that I'm really, really struggling to deal with. But understanding the military ramifications and what actually happened is the way that I personally connect on an intellectual level. And so if that's what you think, if you want to understand really the mistakes and what we need to be doing moving forward, this is the book for you. And hopefully, the stories of the individuals, which again, in this book he reviews, he touches upon a lot of different units and a lot of different things that actually happened, but we need to translate all the books and we have to get all the stories out, and I really believe that. And so this is a great place to start, but it is only the start. It is only the beginning. We need more and more documentation of what happened. And now for our final segment, niche stories that happen in Israel that you're probably not going to hear about on the mainstream media. Okay, do you guys remember Eli Cohen? You're probably actually familiar with him from the Netflix series, okay? He's the big spy in Syria, and this week, interestingly enough, thousands of documentation and pieces of his time as a spy in Syria were brought to Israel and presented to his wife, Nadia, okay? I mean, he was kidnapped years and years and years ago. I think it's about 60 years ago. Well, he wasn't exactly kidnapped. He was caught as a spy, and then he was killed in Syria. And until today, okay, 60 years later, Israel has done a lot of work to try and figure out how to get his body back, how to give him a Jewish burial. And now with everything that's going on with Syria and Turkey and Israel and all of that stuff, and potentially a peace agreement with Syria, his not remains have come back, but all of the documentation at the end of his life and his time as a spy has come back. And it's unbelievable. It's such a miracle. And it's also an important reminder of how much Israel cares about every hostage. We say this every week on the show. Even though we don't agree that a negotiation for a deal is the right way to move forward because we don't believe in the release of terrorists who can propagate another October 7th, we do want every single hostage home, and that's not negotiable. And on that note, I want to talk about the fact that it is David Konya's birthday this week and Eitan Mor. Okay, Eitan Mor is turning 25. You might have heard of him because his father is head of Forum Tukva, head of the hostage family group that doesn't believe in a deal. Okay, and this is a beautiful story about Eitan that I just want to share. 4 months before he was kidnapped, he sat with his family and they were discussing the whole story of Gilad Shalit, and he said, if I'm ever kidnapped, do not release any bodies under any circumstances. Do not release any terrorists in exchange for me. Don't. And his father has taken that and really run with that. And he's received a lot of hate, but that is a beautiful story. And on your birthday, we want to wish you happy birthday and hope to see you home very soon. Another birthday that we are celebrating this week is David Konya, one of 2 brothers who has been kidnapped. And his mother asked that people light Shabbat candles for him in hopes that he comes home safely. And I love this. I love the idea of, instead of us spreading hate and vile conversations around the hostage return, we spread light and we try and connect more to God and pray that they come home. So on that note, please God, bring them home safely, easily, and without too much problems. Another story that's shaking up what's happening in Israel, one of the hostages who was released, she got divorced a few months ago, and she released a statement saying, hi guys, I can't believe I'm doing this, but I need help financially. And this brought up a big debate here in Israel. She managed to raise millions of shekels for her and for her children, and I love that because the Jewish people are amazing and just give so much and contribute so much. But it brought up this conversation of, what is our obligation to the hostages? It is my personal belief that if you are a hostage or if you were impacted by terror, the Israeli government should take care of you, and I would love my tax money to go there. But a lot of people feel like the statement was kind of not really in its place, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Should we be taking care of them, or should these hostages have to fend for themselves? Again, part of a conversation that's been happening here in the country of how the government has taken care of the hostages has not really been seen so positively, and we hope that no hostage ever needs to ask for money again, and that our country and our civilization and Jews everywhere and non-Jews everywhere, everybody who supports us, helps take care of these hostages so they can rebuild their lives and come home to a new life, and hopefully find the mental health that they need and bring up their families in the way that they should. In addition, obviously, we've got more attacks from the Houthis. They woke us up once again, many times. So annoying. And we've also got this interesting story of Palestinian who spat on an IDF soldier commander. I don't know if you saw this video. I actually discussed it this week on the Quad, which I was so happy to be a part of. But there was a female IDF commander or officer. She was sitting on a bus, and this guy came up to her, a Palestinian, and spat on her. And instead of just being shocked and letting it go on, she made this really public. He was arrested. He was actually now released from that to home arrest, which I'm not such a big fan of, but the police said, look, he's not a danger. He's not actually a threat. He just doesn't really like Israel. And I think that's part of the problem with how we look at people who are willing to spit at our IDF soldiers. But yeah, I guess that's the story. And we're very proud of her for standing up for her rights, because in this country, everybody should be able to walk around in their IDF uniform and be rewarded for that, not spat on. That's pretty obvious. And we hope that the country figures out a way to actually deal with people who hate us in our country the proper way, not just by releasing them home, even if they're not deemed as a security threat. In addition, we've got the negotiation of Elizabeth Tsarkov, an Israeli-Russian journalist who was stolen by Iraq, being negotiated because Israelis don't forget hostages anywhere in the world. We've got more attacks in Judea and Samaria, against our Israelis, more terror attacks, but also a Palestinian conflict. So some settlers, so to speak, attacked a city, and they're working on trying to figure out what exactly went on there. We've got some diplomats in Lebanon who didn't go where they were supposed to go, being attacked, not actually attacked by the IDF like the news will tell you, but there were shots fired into the air because they didn't know who they were, and a public apology by the IDF for this. And we've got a really weird thing that happened over the weekend. Hamas phone calls to Israelis with recordings of the hostages trying to scare them. And if you receive such a phone call, make sure to block that number ASAP. And finally, tomorrow is Yom Yerushalayim, or tonight, which is the celebration of Jerusalem, the liberation of Jerusalem, which obviously is the center of Israel, the most amazing place in the entire world. It is such a holy city, it's such a beautiful city, and hundreds of thousands of people will come to Jerusalem to celebrate with flags and with a parade, which is a bit controversial, and we're not going to go into this too much, but here in Israel, there's a big debate between in the education system, which talks about how Zionists we should make our students and how much Jewish education they should have. And some schools came out saying that under no circumstances should we be sending our children to a parade in which they have to walk through Arab sectors. It's against our values. And guess what? Our head of education basically said, no, it's not against our values. And obviously that's a more left-wing mentality here in the country, that we should be removing our God conversations, our Bible conversations, our Jewish history education from schools. That is absolutely not okay. And obviously I'm not for this at all. And so they lost. These schools lost. And these marches will continue with thousands of students coming to celebrate and bringing the words of the Bible to reality. The children of Jerusalem will celebrate in the streets of Jerusalem. And so on that note, I hope that we will only have celebrations here in the city of Jerusalem, here in Israel, with good news coming to us soon. I am Meira K, and I will see you next time.